The wind was the first true thing he had felt in years. It was not a breeze, but a presence, a malevolent intelligence that scoured the high plains and funneled itself down the single, miserable street of the town with the express purpose of stripping away any lingering notion of hope. It carried the grit of 1,000 desolate miles, and it flung that grit into the faces of the few souls foolish or unfortunate enough to be outside, a constant, stinging reminder of their insignificance. The cold was its accomplice, a physical weight that sank its teeth into the frozen mud of the road and seeped through the thickest wool. It was the kind of cold that made a man's breath hang in the air like a ghost of a word he wished he had never spoken, a frozen regret. The man felt it on the exposed skin of his neck as he loaded the last of the supply sacks onto his wagon. He was a solid, deliberate shape against the gray-brown backdrop of the town's false-fronted buildings. His movements were economical, stripped of any wasted energy, the way a man's movements become when he has spent too much time alone with only work for a companion. The townspeople gave him a wide berth. They knew him not as a neighbor, but as a feature of the landscape, as remote and unapproachable as the granite bluffs that framed his distant ranch. He was the solitary man, a figure defined by the space around him, a man who bought his flour and salt and then vanished back into the emptiness from which he had come. He tied off the last rope, his gloved fingers stiff but certain. His work was done. There was nothing left for him in this place of sour glances and whispered judgments but the long, cold ride home. Home to a silence that had, over the past few years, grown from a quiet companion into a roaring void. It was a silence that was becoming too loud to bear. He pulled his hat down low, turning his collar up against the wind's incessant whining, and that was when he saw them. They were huddled in the sliver of shelter offered by the overhanging roof of the train depot, a place where the wind could still get at them, worrying the edges of their thin, dark clothing. A woman and a child, a girl no older than 7 or 8. They were so profoundly out of place that for a moment, his mind refused to properly process the image. Their clothes were not the sturdy denim and wool of this country, but something finer, thinner, and now tattered and wholly inadequate. They were dark-haired and dark-eyed, their features carrying the memory of a sunnier, gentler land. They were outsiders, not just to the town, but to the entire continent, it seemed. They were a piece of a different world, dropped here by a careless god and left to freeze. The townsfolk, in their brisk and bundled comings and goings, flowed around them as if they were a rock in a stream. They were invisible. Worse than invisible, they were an inconvenience, a stain on the day that was best ignored. The woman's arms were wrapped around the child, her own body a desperate, failing shield against the cold. The child's face was buried in her mother's skirt, a small, still bundle of misery. But it was the woman's face that held the man's attention. It was pale with cold and hunger, her lips tinged with blue, but her expression was not one of pleading. It was a mask of fierce, hollowed-out pride. It was the face of someone who had lost everything but the will to stand upright. She met his gaze for a fraction of a second, and in her eyes, he saw not a request for help, but a deep, bottomless desperation that was terrifying in its purity. It was the look of a creature caught in a trap, waiting for the final blow. He had seen that look before. He had seen it in the eyes of a doe his hounds had cornered, and once, long ago, in a mirror. He looked away, his jaw tight. It was not his concern. The world was full of broken things, and he had no spare parts to offer. He had his own emptiness to manage, a carefully curated void that did not welcome intrusions. He took a step toward the driver's seat of his wagon, the leather creaking under his boot. But the image of them remained, burned onto the back of his eyes. The smallness of the child, the terrible stillness of the woman. The wind howled, a mocking laugh, but he was a practical man. And the silence in his cabin was, as he had already admitted to himself, too loud. A dog whined, a door slammed, a horse stamped its foot. These were the sounds of life. His home had none. It had the sound of a tomb. He turned back, his steps heavy on the frozen earth. He walked not to them, but past them, stopping a few feet away, his back mostly to them as he pretended to check the harness on his horse. He did not want to offer pity. Pity was an insult. He would offer a transaction. "The storm will be here by nightfall," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. He did not look at them. He spoke to the air, to the horse, to the world at large. There's no shelter in this town for those who can't pay. He heard a faint rustle of cloth. The woman had shifted, perhaps drawn herself up taller. I need a housekeeper, he went on, his words clipped and devoid of emotion. The work is hard. The pay is a roof and 3 meals. The house is a long way from here. He finally turned his head just enough to see them in his periphery. I'm leaving now. You can take the offer, or you can take your chances with the storm. He did not wait for an answer. He did not ask their names or their story. The offer was laid bare, a stark choice between survival and the freezing indifference of the plains. He swung himself up into the wagon seat, the wood groaning under his weight. He gathered the reins, his gaze fixed forward on the long, bleak road that led out of town. He gave a quiet click of his tongue, and the horses strained against their harnesses, the wagon lurching forward. He did not look back. He was a man who had made an offer. Whether it was accepted was not his concern. He had his own ghosts to outrun. For 100 yards, the only sound was the creak of the wheels and the biting whip of the wind. He kept his eyes on the horizon, a muscle working in his jaw. Then he heard it. A faint, scrambling sound from the back of the wagon. The soft thud of a small body being lifted and the heavier weight of a second person climbing in. He heard the rustle as they settled themselves amongst the sacks of flour and beans. He did not turn. He did not speak. A strange, unfamiliar feeling settled in his chest. It was not warmth, not kindness. It was the quiet, profound relief of a man who has thrown a stone into a bottomless well and, against all expectation, has just heard it hit water. The silence in his cabin tonight would be different. It would no longer be entirely his own. The journey was a long communion with the cold. It was measured not in miles, but in the slow, leaden crawl of the sun toward the jagged teeth of the western mountains. The man never looked back, his shoulders set like a bulwark against the wind and against the presence of the 2 strangers who now occupied the small world of his wagon bed. He could feel them there, a subtle shift in the balance of the load, a faint human weight that was entirely alien to his solitary routine. He imagined them huddled together, the woman's thin coat a poor fortress against the relentless assault of the elements. He thought of the spare wool blanket folded under his seat, a rough, scratchy thing he kept for emergencies. For a long while, he did nothing. It was not his place to offer comfort. He had offered survival. That was the extent of the bargain. But the wind grew teeth as the afternoon waned. It was no longer just a noise. It was a physical force that seemed to be trying to peel the very flesh from their bones. He could hear, beneath the wagon's groaning and the wind's shriek, the chattering of the child's teeth. It was a small, persistent sound, a sound of life being chipped away. With a sigh that was more irritation than compassion, he reached down without turning, fumbled for the blanket, and tossed it back over his shoulder into the wagon bed. He did not hear a thank you, only a soft rustling as the rough wool was drawn over 2 small forms. The small act of impersonal care felt, to him, as loud and significant as a gunshot in the vast, empty landscape. It was a concession, a crack in the fortress of his solitude, and it unnerved him. The woman, for her part, received the blanket as if it were a thrown weapon she had managed to catch. She felt the heavy, scratchy wool land across her and her daughter. She did not look at the man's broad, unmoving back. She simply pulled the fabric around them, creating a small, dark tent of meager warmth. Her daughter burrowed against her, the violent shivering slowly subsiding into a steadier, less frantic trembling. The woman held her, her own body rigid, her mind a whirlwind of fear and a tiny, dangerous spark of something else. This man, this silent, hard-faced stranger, was not like the men in the town. They had looked through her. He had looked at her. He had seen their predicament not as an opportunity for cruelty or pity, but as a problem to be solved with a stark, practical offer. That, in its own way, was more terrifying than overt malice. It was a kindness so sharp and dangerous, it felt like the winter itself. They arrived as the last of the light was being devoured by the bruised purple clouds of the impending storm. The homestead was not a welcoming sight. It was a collection of brutally simple structures, a cabin, a barn, a few corrals, that seemed to have been clawed from the landscape by sheer force of will. They were strong, well-maintained buildings, but they had the air of a military outpost rather than a home. There were no softening touches, no flower beds, no painted trim. There was only wood and stone and the hard-packed, frozen earth. The cabin itself was a solid box of hewn logs, a single plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney into the darkening sky, a lonely signal in the encroaching wilderness. It was, the woman thought with a sinking heart, the home of a man who did not live in it so much as occupy it. It was a place of function, not of comfort. He brought the wagon to a halt near the cabin door and swung down, his movements stiff from the long ride. "Unload the sacks by the door," he commanded, his voice flat. He did not offer to help her or the child down. He simply stated the next task and moved to unhitch the horses, his focus already on the next necessity. The woman stirred, her own limbs screaming in protest. She guided her daughter, still wrapped in the blanket, out of the wagon, her small legs unsteady. Then, without a word, the woman began to wrestle with the heavy sacks of flour and sugar. They were heavier than she had anticipated, and her hunger-weakened body struggled. But she did not falter. Each sack she managed to drag to the cabin's stoop was a statement. "We are not cargo. We are not beggars. We will earn our place." When the man returned from the barn, he found the supplies stacked neatly by the door and the woman standing beside them, her breath pluming in the frigid air, her daughter clinging to her leg. He gave a single, curt nod of acknowledgement and pushed open the cabin door. "Inside," he said. The warmth that met them was a shock, a thick, heavy blanket of heat from a large stone fireplace that dominated one wall. But the interior was even more stark than the outside. It was one large room, scrupulously clean but profoundly empty. A sturdy table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed was built into one corner. A dry sink and a cast-iron stove occupied another. There were shelves holding a few plates and tins, all neatly aligned. But there were no pictures, no curtains, no rugs, no books. There was nothing that spoke of a life lived, of memories made. The very air seemed thin, scrubbed clean of any human residue. It was a space that had been hollowed out, its soul removed. The man gestured toward the table. "Sit." He moved to the stove, where a pot of stew had been simmering over a low heat. He ladled the thick, savory mixture into 2 bowls and set them on the table with 2 spoons and a loaf of dark bread. He did not serve himself. He stood by the fireplace, his back to them, and began to stir the embers. The woman and her child ate. They ate with a silent, desperate ferocity that was primal. They did not speak, did not look up. The only sounds were the scrape of spoon against bowl and the child's small, gulping swallows. The stew was simple, meat, potatoes, onions, but to them, it was the most ambrosial meal of their lives. It was the taste of survival, the feeling of life flowing back into frozen limbs and hollow bellies. The woman forced herself to slow down, to make sure her daughter ate her fill first, but the hunger was a wild animal inside her. The man watched them. He had acquired necessities, he told himself. That is all they were. A solution to the silence. A pair of hands to manage the chores he had neglected since before. When they were finished, the bowls wiped clean with the last of the bread, a heavy silence fell upon the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The storm had arrived, and the wind now screamed around the corners of the cabin like a hungry wolf. The woman rose and gathered the bowls. She took them to the dry sink and began to wash them with water from a bucket, her movements efficient and sure. The man finally turned from the fire. He pointed toward a ladder in the far corner. "The loft," he said. "There are blankets. That's your space." The message was clear as a line drawn in the dirt. He was providing a roof, but not a home. He was offering shelter, but not welcome. There was his space, down here by the fire, and there was their space, up there in the cold darkness of the loft. He had established the distance, both physical and emotional. They were a necessity he had acquired, and they would be treated as such. The woman simply nodded. She took her daughter's hand, and without another word, they climbed the ladder into the shadows. The man stood alone in the center of the room, listening to the faint sounds of them settling in for the night above him. He listened to the howl of the storm outside. For the first time in a long time, the sounds from outside the cabin were louder than the silence within it. He was not sure if that was a comfort or a curse. The storm locked them in for 3 days. It was a howling, white-walled prison. erasing the world beyond the cabin windows and burying the landscape under a deep, silent blanket of snow. For the man, this confinement was a familiar state. Winter on the high plains was a season of enforced solitude, of turning inward and waiting. But this time, he was not alone, and the presence of the woman and child transformed the small space. It became a crucible, a silent testing ground where the rhythms of their separate lives began to intersect. He was a man in constant, restless motion. He rose before the sun, his movements quiet but purposeful, stoking the fire, checking his gear, his mind always on the next task. He would spend hours in the small portion of the barn accessible through a snow-choked walkway, mending tack or sharpening tools, the rhythmic scrape of a whetstone or the tap of a hammer a steady counterpoint to the storm's fury. He was a man who fought against stillness with work. The woman, in turn, established her own domain within the cabin. After the first morning, when she had watched him perform his sparse domestic chores with a grim, male-handed inefficiency, she had simply taken over. She did not ask. She observed, and then she acted. The cabin, already clean, became orderly. The tins on the shelves were rearranged. The floor was swept until the wood shone. She found his meager store of mending supplies and set to work on his worn shirts, her stitches small and neat and impossibly straight. She was quiet, unobtrusive, but her presence began to fill the empty spaces he had so carefully maintained. She brought an order to his life that went beyond mere tidiness. Her daughter was a small, silent shadow. She moved with a caution that was heartbreaking in one so young, her eyes wide and watchful. She would sit for hours on a small stool near the fire. Out of the way, a small, worn doll, her only possession, clutched in her hands. The man found himself acutely aware of her, of the small sounds she made, a soft sigh, the whisper of her clothes as she shifted. He had not been around a child in 5 years. The experience was like probing a wound he had thought long scarred over, only to find it still raw and bleeding. On the second day, the woman, having exhausted the visible chores, approached him as he sat at the table cleaning a rifle. Her shadow fell over his work. He looked up, his expression guarded. "There is more work," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement. "Show me." He was taken aback. He had expected her to be grateful for the shelter, to remain a passive recipient of his provision. He had not expected this quiet, insistent demand to contribute. "There is nothing for you to do until the snow stops," he said, his voice flat. "I will not be a sheltered pet," she replied, her voice low but unwavering. "I will not eat the bread of charity when I have hands that can work." Her pride was a tangible thing, a shield she held up against her own desperation. He stared at her for a long moment, seeing the unyielding set of her jaw. He saw a resilience that matched the harshness of the land itself. Reluctantly, he gestured toward a large, heavy trunk in the corner, a trunk he had not opened in years. "There are things in there," he said gruffly. "Old linens that need mending. Blankets. Sort through it. See what can be salvaged." It was a make-work task, meant to occupy her, but she accepted it with a solemn nod. She dragged the heavy trunk to the center of the room and lifted the lid. The scent of cedar and old memories filled the air. Inside were folded blankets, yellowed sheets, and at the very bottom, a small collection of items wrapped in oilcloth. As the woman began to sort through the linens, her hands gentle and methodical, the child crept closer, peering into the trunk's depths. Her small hand darted in and picked up an object that had fallen from a fold of a blanket. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its wings slightly askew, the paint faded. It was unmistakably the work of a child's hand. The man, who had been watching from the corner of his eye, froze. The rifle lay forgotten in his hands. He saw the bird in the girl's small fingers, and the room seemed to tilt on its axis. He could almost feel the phantom weight of the small hand that had carved it, could almost hear the ghost of a small, proud voice saying, "Look, Papa." The woman saw the change in him. She saw the blood drain from his face, the sudden, stark agony that tightened his features. She quickly and gently took the bird from her daughter's hand. "We put this back," she whispered to the child. She carefully placed the bird back into the trunk and looked at the man, her dark eyes holding a sudden, profound understanding. She had just stumbled into the heart of his emptiness. She had found the name of his ghost. She said nothing. She simply closed the lid of the trunk and pushed it back against the wall. The task was abandoned. She had seen more than she was meant to, and she knew, with an instinct born of her own losses, that this was a boundary that must never be crossed again. The silence that fell in the cabin was different now. It was heavier, filled with the shared, unspoken knowledge of grief. When the storm finally broke on the fourth morning, the world was a pristine, blinding expanse of white. The work, which had been held at bay, now descended upon them. The man, seemingly grateful for the physical exertion, worked with a feverish intensity, digging paths from the cabin to the barn, clearing the snow from the corral roofs. He expected the woman and child to remain inside. Instead, the woman appeared at his side, wrapped in one of the old blankets from the trunk, her face determined. She had found a smaller shovel in the barn. "I will clear the path to the well," she announced. He started to object, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She would not be denied her contribution. He gave a curt, reluctant nod and watched as she began to work, her movements awkward at first, then growing stronger and more rhythmic. Her daughter followed, using her mittened hands to scoop away the lighter snow from the edges of her mother's path. The man's foreman and two ranch hands, who lived in a bunkhouse further down the valley, rode up around noon, their own digging out complete. They stopped short, their expressions a mixture of confusion and suspicion as they saw the woman and child. They looked from them to the man, their eyebrows raised in a silent, pointed question. The foreman, a grizzled man with cautious eyes, dismounted. "Boss," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Looks like the snow brought some new things to light." The man did not stop his work. He drove his shovel into the heavy drift. "This is my new housekeeper," he stated, his voice flat and final, leaving no room for discussion. "Her and her daughter. They'll be staying." The foreman's eyes flickered to the woman, who continued her work, her back to them, refusing to acknowledge their scrutiny. He saw her worn clothes, her foreign features, and the fierce, concentrated way she worked, as if her life depended on it. He saw the child, a small, bundled figure, diligently helping. He looked back at his boss, at the man's closed-off expression, and whatever questions he had, he swallowed them. The boss had declared it, and so it was. He and his men exchanged a look, a silent agreement to watch and wait. The fragile refuge the man had offered was no longer a secret. It was now a fact, laid bare for the world to see and, inevitably, to judge. The judgment was not long in coming. It arrived a week later, in a polished black buggy drawn by a pair of high-stepping bays, a stark and ostentatious intrusion into the ranch's world of worn leather and weathered wood. The buggy belonged to the social tyrant of the county, the wife of a wealthy cattle baron whose land bordered the man's own. She was a woman for whom propriety was not a virtue but a weapon, and whose social standing was maintained by the careful observation and public condemnation of the failings of others. Her appearance was a stark contrast to the rough-hewn world she had entered. She was draped in dark, expensive wool and furs, her face a carefully composed mask of condescending pleasantry. The man saw the buggy approaching from the corral where he was working with his foreman. A knot of cold dread tightened in his stomach. He had not had a social call in 5 years, not since the last of the pitying neighbors had given up on trying to draw him from his grief. This was not a visit of condolence. This was an inspection, an inquisition. "Company," the foreman grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the snow. "And not the good kind." The man said nothing. He laid down his tool and walked with deliberate, unhurried steps toward the cabin, his face set like granite. He would meet this confrontation head-on. He reached the porch just as the social tyrant was stepping down from her buggy, her driver holding the door. She smiled, a thin, sharp expression that did not touch her cold eyes. "My dear man," she began, her voice carrying a tone of false, syrupy concern. "I was so worried. We haven't seen you in town since before the great storm. I had to come and make sure you were quite all right. All alone out here." Her gaze flickered pointedly past him, toward the cabin door, from which the woman had emerged, her hands wrapped in her apron, her expression wary. The social tyrant's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. She took in the woman's foreign features, her simple, mended dress, her quiet, dignified posture. Her smile tightened. This was exactly the sort of impropriety she thrived on exposing. "Oh, she said, her voice dripping with feigned surprise. It seems you are not so alone after all. I must have been misinformed. She turned her attention fully to the woman, looking her up and down as if she were a piece of livestock of questionable breeding. And who might this be? The man stepped slightly forward, placing himself between the two women. His movement was small, but its meaning was unmistakable. This is my housekeeper, he said, his voice low and even, a warning rumble beneath the surface. Your housekeeper? The social tyrant repeated, drawing the word out. She let out a small, cruel laugh. How resourceful of you. To find help so far from civilization. One hears stories about the sort of women who wander the countryside without family or funds. One must be so careful about the company one keeps, especially with hands on the property. It sets a poor moral example. The insinuation was as thick and foul as mud, and it was made for the benefit of the foreman and the other hands, who had stopped their work to watch, their faces carefully blank. The goal was public shaming, the assertion of her dominance over this small, isolated kingdom. The woman flinched as if struck. Her face paled, but she held her ground, her chin high. She would not give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. The man felt a surge of cold, clean anger, an emotion so pure and direct it felt like coming home. For years, his anger had been a dull, internal thing, directed at fate, at God, at himself. This was different. This was a shield. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He took another step forward, and the sheer, quiet authority of his presence seemed to suck the air from around them. She and her daughter are under my protection, he said. The words were simple, declarative, and absolute. He looked directly into the social tyrant's eyes, his gaze flat and unyielding. This is their home now. You are not welcome here. It was a dismissal so total, so utterly devoid of the social niceties she used as currency, that she was momentarily stunned into silence. She had come expecting to find a broken, grieving recluse whom she could easily intimidate. She had found instead a man made of iron, her face mottled with fury, the mask of pleasantry shattering. Well, I never, she sputtered, gathering the shreds of her dignity. The whole county will hear of this. Harboring vagrants, living in sin. You will be a pariah. I already am, the man said, his voice utterly devoid of concern. Now get off my land. He turned his back on her then, the most profound insult he could offer, and walked to the woman's side on the porch. He stood there, a silent, solid guard, until the social tyrant, sputtering with impotent rage, had climbed back into her buggy and departed, leaving a trail of angry, churning snow in her wake. The foreman, watching from the corral, slowly broke into a grin and spat again on the ground. He picked up his tool and went back to work. The show was over. The boss had drawn his line. In the aftermath, a heavy, charged silence descended upon the porch. The fragile piece of their arrangement had been shattered by the outside world's ugly intrusion. The woman stood stiffly, not looking at him, her hands twisting in her apron. He had defended her, publicly and absolutely, and the shock of it was still settling in her bones. No one had defended her for a very long time. The silence in the cabin that evening was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers coexisting. It was the silence of allies who had faced a common enemy. It was heavy with unspoken things, with the question of what, exactly, he had just declared to the world and to them. He had called this their home. He had placed them under his protection. These were words with weight, words that built fences and staked claims. And now, in the quiet of the firelit cabin, they both had to reckon with the consequences. For days after the confrontation, the air in the cabin remained thick with the unsaid. The woman moved through her chores with her usual quiet efficiency, but there was a new tension in her shoulders, a new watchfulness in her eyes. The man's public defense of her had been a shield, but it had also been a spotlight, illuminating the precariousness of their situation. He had named her place in his home, but he had not explained it. The word home hung between them, a fragile and undefined thing. She felt suspended between gratitude and a deep, gnawing uncertainty. She needed to understand the foundation of the ground she stood on. One evening, after the child was asleep in the loft, and the only sounds were the sighing of the wind outside and the pop and crackle of the fire, she finally broke the silence. He was sitting at the table, oiling a piece of leather harness, his hands moving with slow, methodical grace. She stood by the hearth, gathering the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind since the day he had thrown the blanket into the wagon. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the quiet of the room like a shard of glass. He stopped his work, his hands going still on the leather. He did not look up immediately. He seemed to be considering the simple, one-word question as if it were a complex legal document. He had been expecting it, in a way. He had been dreading it. To answer it would be to open a door he had nailed shut 5 years ago. "Why did you help us?" she clarified, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. "In the town. No one else even saw us. You did. Why?" He set the piece of leather down on the table with deliberate care. He ran a hand over his tired face, the gesture of a man confronting a great weight. For a long time, he said nothing, and she thought he would simply ignore her, retreat back into the fortress of his silence. But then he spoke, his voice low and rough, aimed at the floorboards between them. "Because this house had too much nothing in it," he began, the words coming slowly, as if he were digging them out of frozen ground. "After my wife, after Martha, and our girl, Sarah, after the fever took them, this place became an echo chamber. Every sound I made just reminded me of the sounds that weren't here anymore. The silence was so loud it hurt my ears." He finally lifted his head and looked at her, and for the first time, she saw past the stoic protector to the haunted man beneath. His eyes were filled with a desolation that mirrored her own. "When I saw you," he continued, "you and your daughter, I saw you had nothing, nothing left. And I thought, maybe your nothing and my too much nothing could cancel each other out. I didn't do it to be kind. I did it for me. I did it because I couldn't stand the silence anymore. The sound of your child breathing in the loft, it's a better kind of silence. It's the sound of life. I'd forgotten what that was." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and profoundly honest. He had not offered her a story of charity or nobility, but one of shared brokenness. He had seen in her desperation a reflection of his own emptiness, and in an act of pure, selfish survival, he had reached out. Tears she did not know she still possessed welled in the woman's eyes. His grief was a key that unlocked her own. In his stark honesty, he had given her a gift far greater than shelter or food. He had given her understanding. He had seen her not as a burden, but as a fellow survivor. Now it was her turn. She reached into the pocket of her apron and drew out a small, cloth-wrapped object. She sat down in the chair opposite him at the table and slowly unwrapped it. It was a small, exquisitely carved jade butterfly, no bigger than her thumb. One of its delicate wings was chipped. "My husband was a scholar," she began, her voice gaining a quiet rhythm as she retreated into memory. "A poet. He was not a practical man. He believed in words, in beauty. He gave this to me on our wedding day." She gently touched the chipped wing. "We lived in a city by the sea, a world away from here. But the men in power there did not like his words. They did not like that he taught people to think for themselves." Her story tumbled out, a torrent of loss and fear. She spoke of a powerful, wealthy man, a man of influence who wanted her for himself, a man who saw her as a beautiful object to be possessed. When she refused him, he used his power to ruin her husband. The scholar was declared an enemy of the state. His books were burned, and he was imprisoned. He died there. "That man," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The one who did this, he is the transactional villain of my life. He believes I am his property, that my daughter is his property, a debt to be collected. We fled with nothing but the clothes on our backs and this small, broken thing. We ran across an ocean, across a country, selling what little we had until there was nothing left to sell. We ended up in that town because the money ran out. We were waiting to die." She looked up from the jade butterfly and met his gaze. "You did not offer us charity. You offered us a chance to stop running. But he will not stop looking. A man like that never does." A profound shift occurred in the room. The confession had transformed everything. They were no longer a man and his housekeeper, a rescuer and the rescued. They were allies, bound by a shared understanding of loss and a shared enemy. He looked at the woman, at the fierce, fragile strength in her eyes, and at the sleeping loft where her daughter lay, and he understood. The social tyrant from down the valley was a nuisance, a creature of gossip and spite. But this man from the woman's past, This transactional villain, he was a true danger. He was a wolf that was still on their trail. The man reached across the table and his large, calloused fingers gently touched the back of her hand, a brief, fleeting contact that was more powerful than any embrace. "A roof is not enough," he said, his voice quiet but infused with a new, hard resolve. "What you need is a fortress. We'll build 1 inch." In that moment, the man's personal grief began its slow retreat. It was no longer the sole occupant of his heart. A new purpose had taken root, not just to fill the silence, but to defend the people who had brought a new, better kind of quiet to his world. The found family had been forged in the crucible of confession, and now they had a war to prepare for. The peace that followed their shared confessions was a fragile, working peace, the quiet hum of a machine whose parts had finally aligned. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, melting the snow in slow patches and revealing the bruised, muddy earth beneath. The work of the ranch exploded. The man, the woman, and even the child were subsumed by it. They worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, tending to the new calves, and preparing the small garden plot near the cabin. The woman, who had once been a scholar's wife in a city by the sea, proved to have an astonishing aptitude for the hard, practical labor of the land. She had a gentle hand with the animals and a fierce determination in the garden. The man watched her, a quiet respect growing in him daily. She was not just earning her keep. She was becoming an indispensable part of the ranch's lifeblood. But beneath the surface of the daily toil, the threat of the transactional villain loomed, a shadow on the horizon. The man knew it was not a matter of if, but when. The world was shrinking, with telegraph lines and railroads stitching the vast continent together. A man with money and influence could cast a very long net. The threat arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet, smug confidence of a man who believes the law is simply a tool for his own use. He appeared in town one afternoon, stepping off the eastbound train. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored city suit, his shoes polished to a high shine, a stark contrast to the dusty, work-worn inhabitants of the town. He carried a leather satchel and an air of absolute, unassailable authority. This was the transactional villain, a man who saw people not as souls, but as assets on a ledger. He made inquiries at the land office, at the general store. He was smooth, charming, and his questions were couched in the language of legitimate business. He was looking for a woman and a child, he explained, who were under an indenture contract to him. A contract, he lamented, they had broken. He painted a picture of himself as a benevolent patron, and them as ungrateful runaways. The social tyrant, hearing of his arrival, was only too eager to confirm his story and point him in the direction of the solitary man's ranch. It was the perfect vindication for her earlier humiliation. He did not go to the ranch immediately. He went to the lawman first. He presented his documents, a sheaf of papers, signed and stamped with official-looking seals, detailing a massive debt owed by the woman's late husband, a debt for which she was now responsible. The papers included an indenture agreement, signing her and her daughter into his service until the debt was paid, an impossible sum that would take a lifetime of labor. The lawman, a pragmatic man who respected the power of paper and wealth, examined the documents. They looked legitimate. The villain was persuasive. The law, as far as he could see, was on the side of the well-dressed man from the city. The next day, the villain rode out to the ranch, not in a hired buggy, but on a fine horse, as if to prove he was at home in this world as well as his own. He found the man and the woman near the barn, repairing a corral gate. The woman saw him first. All the color drained from her face. She dropped the tool she was holding, and her hand flew to her throat. It was a gesture of pure, instinctual terror. The man saw her reaction and turned, his body immediately positioning itself between her and the newcomer. The villain dismounted slowly, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. He ignored the man completely, his eyes fixed on the woman. "My dear," he said, his voice a silken menace, "you have led me on quite a chase. But all debts must be paid, one way or another. I have come to collect what is mine." "She is not yours," the man said, his voice a low growl. The villain finally deigned to look at him, his gaze dismissive. "And you are? The noble rescuer?" "I have a legal contract, signed and sealed. The lawman in town has seen it." She and the child belong to me until her husband's debt is cleared. He opened his satchel and produced the papers, holding them up. I am a reasonable man. I will give you 3 days. 3 days to hand them over peacefully. After that, I will return with the lawman, and the matter will be settled with less dignity. He paused, his eyes glinting. Do not try to run. The railroad is watched. Every road is watched. You are cornered. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving his ultimatum hanging in the air like poison. Panic seized the woman. She began to tremble, her breath coming in ragged gasps. We have to run, she whispered, her eyes wild with fear. We have to go now. The man gripped her shoulders, his touch firm and grounding. No, he said, his voice resolute. This is your home. We don't run from here. We fight from here. That night, the cabin became a war room. The initial terror gave way to a desperate, focused energy. The man lit every lamp he owned, and the small space was cast in a bright, flickering glow, a tiny bastion of defiance against the vast darkness outside. He said the papers were legal, the woman said, pacing the floor. He is a master of lies, but his lies are always wrapped in the appearance of truth. Then we have to find the lie, the man replied. He looked at her, a thought forming in his mind. Your husband was a scholar. What about you? I kept his accounts, she said, a flicker of the old life in her eyes. I managed the household. I am good with numbers. And with details. A grim hope began to dawn. His lie will have a flaw, the man insisted. A mistake in the numbers, a date that doesn't add up. We just have to find it. But they had no documents to examine, only the villain's claims. It was her word against his paper. And in this world, paper was king. Then the man remembered something. His life before the ranch, before the grief. He had not always been a recluse. He had worked for a time in a city far to the east, for a large freight company. He had dealt with contracts, with bills of lading, with men who bent the law for a living. And he had made a few contacts, men who owed him favors, men who knew how to find information that was meant to stay hidden. It was a long shot, a ghost from a past life, but it was the only shot they had. There's a man, he said slowly. In the capital. He works in the Central Telegraph office. He sees things, hears things. He went to his desk and pulled out a piece of paper. He began to write, his hand moving swiftly. It was a short, coded message, referencing an old debt, a shared secret from a long-forgotten business deal. It named the transactional villain and the city he came from, and asked for any and all information. Warrants, business dealings, aliases. The foreman will ride for the telegraph office in town, he said, his voice tight with urgency. It's almost a full day's ride there and back. It might be too late, but it's all I have. The foreman was roused from the bunkhouse, and without question, he took the message and rode into the night. The man and woman were left alone in the brightly lit cabin, with the clock ticking down. For the next 2 days, they existed in a state of suspended terror, starting at every sound, every shadow. They tried to work, but their movements were strained, their thoughts elsewhere. The deadline loomed. On the morning of the 3rd day, the foreman had not returned. The sun rose in a clear, pitiless sky. Around mid-morning, they saw the dust cloud on the horizon. 3 riders. The transactional villain, the lawman, and, bringing up the rear, the social tyrant, her face a mask of smug triumph, there to witness the righteous eviction she had so longed for. The man met them on the porch. The woman stood in the doorway behind him, her daughter clutching her skirt, her face pale but her eyes defiant. Time is up, the villain announced, swinging down from his horse. I trust you will be sensible. The lawman shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He was a man of the law, and the law, as presented to him, was clear. I'm sorry, son, he said to the man, but the paperwork is in order. I have to enforce the contract. The villain smiled, a victor's smile. He took a step toward the porch. Come now, my dear, he said to the woman. Your little holiday is over. At that exact moment, another sound reached them. The frantic, desperate drumming of a horse ridden at a full gallop. All heads turned. It was the foreman, his horse lathered in sweat, foam flying from its mouth. He did not slow down until he was nearly upon them, pulling the horse to a skidding halt. He vaulted from the saddle, a yellow piece of paper clutched in his hand. Telegraph, he gasped, thrusting it at the man. The man took the paper, his hand steady. He read the coded message, his expression unreadable. The villain's smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The man looked up from the paper, his gaze locking onto the lawman. "This indenture contract," he said, his voice ringing with cold authority. "What is the date on it?" The villain scoffed. "What does it matter? It is legal." "The date," the man repeated to the lawman. The lawman, sensing a shift in the wind, pulled the document from his coat. "It's dated a year ago, March the 14th. The man held up the telegraph. "This is a message from the federal marshal's office in the eastern capital. It confirms that the man standing before you," he pointed a finger at the villain, "is a known fraud and confidence man. It also confirms that on March the 14th of last year, he was serving the third year of a 5-year sentence in a federal prison for fraud. He was released 2 months ago." The reversal was total and absolute. The silence that fell was stunning. The villain's face collapsed, the smug confidence evaporating into pure animal panic. The contract was a forgery, a clumsy one at that. "Furthermore," the man continued, his voice like chipping ice, "there is a federal warrant for his arrest for violating his parole. The marshal's office requests that you detain him." The lawman looked from the telegraph to the ashen-faced villain, and then back to the man on the porch. The choice was clear. The law had a new, more powerful master: the truth. He slowly drew his pistol. "Well, I'll be," the lawman said, a slow grin spreading across his face. He tipped his hat to the man. "Looks like you had it handled." He dismounted and walked toward the villain, the pistol held steady. "You're under arrest." The social tyrant let out a choked gasp, her face a comical mask of thwarted victory and public humiliation. Without another word, she yanked the reins of her horse and fled, unable to bear witness to her own spectacular misjudgment. As the lawman secured the sputtering, defeated villain, the woman stepped out onto the porch, the sunlight hitting her face. She looked at the man, at this quiet, solitary protector who had summoned ghosts from his past to build a fortress around her. Tears streamed down her face, but this time, they were tears of triumphant, unbelievable relief. The war was over. They had won. The spring that followed was not just a changing of the season. It was the beginning of a new life. The arrest of the transactional villain and the subsequent humiliation of the social tyrant sent ripples through the county. The story of the forged contract and the last-minute telegraph became a local legend, a tale of quiet, clever justice winning out over loud-mouthed arrogance. The solitary man was no longer seen as just a reclusive eccentric. He was a man of hidden depths, a man of unshakable honor who protected his own. And the woman and her child, once viewed with suspicion, were now seen through a lens of respect and sympathy. They were survivors, not vagrants. The ranch itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The cloud of impending doom had lifted, and in its place, a sense of permanence began to settle. The change was most visible in the man himself. The haunted, restless energy that had always driven him began to soften, replaced by a deep, quiet contentment. The lines of grief around his eyes did not disappear, but they were joined by new lines, lines etched by faint, infrequent smiles. He was no longer just occupying his home, he was starting to live in it. One morning, he began digging new foundations near the cabin. He worked with a familiar, deliberate focus, but there was a new purpose in his labor. The woman watched him from the porch, her hands still. "What are you building?" she asked. He looked up, leaning on his shovel, and wiped a line of sweat from his brow. "A new room," he said simply, "and a bigger kitchen. A house needs to fit the people in it." It was his way of saying everything. It was his way of tearing down the last wall of his solitude, of acknowledging that his life was no longer a singular existence. The cabin, once a monument to his loss, was being physically transformed into a home for his new, found family. The woman's heart swelled with a feeling so profound and peaceful it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. She went inside and returned with a glass of cool water for him, a simple, domestic act that felt more significant than any vow. The space around them transformed as well. The woman's garden flourished under her patient care, producing rows of vibrant vegetables and, to the man's quiet surprise, a riot of colorful, hardy wildflowers she had planted along the porch. The child's laughter, once a rare and fragile sound, became a common music on the ranch, a bright, thread woven into the fabric of their days. She had a small flock of chickens she tended to with solemn importance, and she would follow the man on his chores, chattering away, her presence a constant, joyful reminder of the life that had returned to this place. The ranch hands, who had once been cautiously distant, were now fiercely protective, treating the woman with a gruff respect and the child with a doting affection they tried clumsily to hide. Months melted into a season, and the addition to the cabin took shape under the man's skilled hands. The harsh emptiness of the interior was softened by touches the woman added. Simple curtains sewn from flour sacks, a colorful rag rug for the floor, a jar of wildflowers on the table. They were small things, but they were the markers of life, of care, of a space being claimed and loved. The jade butterfly, its chipped wing a reminder of a past survived, sat on the mantelpiece, no longer a symbol of flight, but of arrival. One evening, as the summer sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose, the three of them sat on the newly finished porch. The man had built a swing, wide enough for them all. He sat at one end, the woman at the other, and the child was curled asleep between them, her head resting on the man's thigh. A comfortable, easy silence settled over them, the kind of silence that is not an absence of sound, but a presence of peace. The soft sounds of life, the lowing of cattle in the distance, the chirping of crickets, the gentle creak of the swing, were the only accompaniment. The man was no longer defined by his grief. He was a protector, a builder, a father, a partner. He looked at the woman, her profile serene in the fading light, and he felt a sense of rightness so profound it was almost overwhelming. The gaping hole in his life had not been patched over. It had been filled with something new, something unexpected and precious. The woman felt his gaze and turned to him, a soft, knowing smile on her lips. She had found more than a refuge here. She had found a home in the truest sense of the word. She had found a place where her strength was valued, her past was understood, and her future was safe. She had found a partner whose quiet strength was a bedrock she could build her new life upon. He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the sleeping child's back. His touch was warm, sure, and full of unspoken promises. "A home isn't the land you own," he said, his voice quiet, the words coming as easily as breath. "It's not the roof or the walls." He looked from the woman to the child, then out at the vast, beautiful, and no longer lonely landscape that was theirs. "It is the people you choose to protect on it." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes closing as the last of the light faded from the sky. The gentle motion of the swing was a lullaby, a promise of countless peaceful nights to come. The solitary man was no longer alone. The resilient survivors were no longer running, and the quiet ranch at the edge of the world had finally, truly, become a home.